Welcome, Dr. Paul.
Thank you.
Super excited to have you on the podcast and introduce you better to the Unicity audience. For people that don't know, Dr. Paul Reynolds is one of the more recent additions to Unicity Science Advisory Board. It was a connection we made through our friend, Dr. Benjamin Bikman, and I, Sam Hughes, am super excited to sit down and be able to chat in depth with Dr. Paul about his expertise and how that relates to, some of the things in the Unicity world, both our products and other aspects that some people who have been to the method may be more familiar with. And whatever else comes up.
Yeah.
And I always try and take advantage of days to ask whatever questions I think are interesting.
I love it. Thanks
But
for having me.
to kick off, can you just give us a quick introduction to, how you got into your specialty, and then from there, that's how you came in to know Unicity and get involved with that itself.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for asking. I've had kind of an interesting path that I've taken in my professional life. I'm one of 9 kids, so I'm number 6 of 9, a big family.
Awesome.
And Dad was a doctor. We didn't have the most extravagant lifestyle, but I remember even as a kid, we had what we needed, right? We were able to get by really well. So that kind of from a young age impressed me about the fact that, eventually I'd like to have a family and be able to provide.
Yeah. And are you on the younger side or the older side?
I'm number 6.
I'm number 6. Oh, right here. Okay, excellent.
Yeah. Yeah, so the lower half, right, we had probably a different set of rules probably in the first half, but it worked out well. We had a great family life. And from my early stages, I thought, what, Dad's a physician. He was a foot doctor. And I thought, maybe that's what I needed to do. So kind of following the path that I saw in my family to eventually become a professional was kind of the thought. So lo and behold, I'm in school. I'm going to be a doctor. I get excited about dentistry. As an undergraduate, I thought, I need to be a dentist. I have an interesting characteristic in that, when teeth develop, they go through a series of stages. And one of the last stages is the Bell stage. And then mine, it's split in 2. So I actually have 3 sets of teeth. Oh, I'm on my 3rd set. 2 sets of deciduous teeth, which was quite helpful with, unfortunate interactions with the diving board and the refrigerator as a kid, knocking out a bunch of teeth. That happens in about 1 out of every 55,000 or so.
Yeah.
I usually tell my wife I'm 1 in a million, but it's really like 1 in 50,000 approximately. So I thought, hey, that's what I need to do. I need to learn all about that. So my path has always kind of been becoming exposed to something and then asking questions. So at the end of my undergraduate career, I got married and my wife needed to finish her degree before we left. And I thought, this is perfect. I'll just kind of hang out in the lab. And I got involved with an older faculty member. We focused on birth defects research. And I thought, wow, that's pretty exciting. So this whole idea of being exposed to research, which was pretty rare back in those days, at BYU where I did my training, not a lot of research opportunities, but we looked at kind of the consequences of toxication type stuff. Reproductive toxicology is what many would call that. And I thought, hey, this is great. And from that point forward, I got excited about research. It's almost as though I forgot entirely about the professional dreams.
Yeah.
So then I go to Cincinnati. That's where I did my graduate work. After getting a master's degree at BYU, I got into a lab in Cincinnati, and I found a fellow that was a high-quality lung researcher. Didn't have any inherent, interest in the lung, per se. Funny story on the side. A friend of ours in our church in that area said, hey, you should look up Jeff Whitsett. I'd never even heard of the guy. And lo and behold, he's nearly a Nobel laureate and one of the world's best in lung stuff. So I got excited about that. So my focus at that point was what causes the lung to develop in the way it should. There are all these kind of dominoes that have to follow, in order to derive a lung that's functional enough to where it doesn't really need to be used moments before birth, but the moment you're born, you need it instantly. Mm-hmm. And I got really excited about that. Breathing is one of those most essential, yet most probably one would say automatic processes we have, right? When I imagine how many birthday candles I'll need to blow out this year, I can control my lungs in a voluntary way through my somatic nervous system. I could take a big deep breath. I can hold that air, blow out the candles. I could hold my breath while I'm swimming, all those types of things I could do voluntarily. But what's nice is when I focus on something else, the autonomic part of that story kicks in. Only a few muscles do it that way. A voluntary control group of muscles can then be controlled involuntarily, and my breathing will take over. So I kind of got excited about that. And so to kind of wrap that story up, I've focused my attention on lung biology, but in the last decade, my eyes have been opened in many ways. Part of that was interactions with Dr. Ben, as you've mentioned. He and I are colleagues in the same department. We've interacted for over a decade, and he's been a great kind of mentor for me in my career as I've tried to mentor him in his. But what's interesting is, even though we become siloed as researchers or clinicians in our disease of interest or our physiological process that we think is most important, when we fail to see the interaction among all the organ systems, we lose sight on a lot of the story, really, of life. And that's kind of where I've come from and where I'm going, is the impact on what the lung does with regard to overall metabolic health.
And that's before I forget, you want to move the mic closer to your mouth. That'll help. It's the audio. All right. Should have said that before. But that's something I'm really interested in, because like Unicity, right, we're very hyper-focused on combating insulin resistance. We want to help people with that specific way to dramatically improve their metabolic health, because we know there's all these various symptoms of being insulin resistant that people, right, consider as diseases that lots of doctors specialize specifically in this aspect. And of all of that, I would say that the lung is one of the least considered aspects of how that might play into the insulin resistance picture. Like you think of the cardiovascular things, the fat cells, and diabetes, and all these things. And I personally just don't usually work in like the breathing to all these other things that are going wrong with the body and where that's showing up. And so I'm just curious, what have you been learning as you've been beginning to focus in on that in terms of this overall relationship? And then I can dig in more specifically in areas.
No, great. That's a great question. And that, I think I would agree, many fail to see kind of the connections. As I've mentioned, breathing is one of the most automatic but essential processes we do. Obviously, we can go for weeks without food, not recommended, but it's possible. Good days without water, but, oxygen we can only survive without for just a minute or two. And so the lungs are set up in such a way that we need to obtain the oxygen, warm and humidify the air as needed, deliver to the right amounts, the right locations of the body so they can do their work. The problem, though, is that even though we're after the oxygen, there's so many other particulates in the air that we need to grapple with. And that's kind of where the segue can be drawn between metabolic health and general oxygen delivery.
Yeah.
So what we could say in that regard is the idea that, there are fine particulates that are in the air. They're abundantly available. They're so small they never settle. And these particulates are things that are generated from vehicular exhaust. They come from fine dust. They come from microplastics, cooking smoke. All those types of things generate particles that are so small they can penetrate deep into the lung and even enter into the bloodstream. There's a lot of research that shows that the things that we breathe, obviously the lung is compromised in that case, but those same things are found abundantly in all the tissues throughout the body. So a lot of people have asked, well, how's it getting there? It's not only an ingestion type situation, it's the breathing part that is a problem.
So I think this is really something interesting to learn, because what I'm hearing is there's a lot more to what the breathing is doing than, right, taking in oxygen to our bodies. And so maybe where we need to start is really what happens throughout all these different, organs or muscular structure as we just go about breathing day in, day out.
Yeah. So when we breathe in, obviously, again, as I mentioned, the oxygen is the ultimate goal, but there's so many other bad guys that hitch a ride in the process. Yeah. And that's what's going to be the main compromising effect. We've done a lot of research that shows that these particulates, again, disperse throughout the body, and they have a large role to play in, you mentioned insulin resistance. When these particulates get into the body, they can cause inflammation. Inflammation is a huge breeding ground, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more about that as we go. But inflammation and oxidative stress both work together to provide an environment where muscles, tissues, all the different cells of the body can be compromised. And we know so much more now than we ever have before about the idea that, yes, the lung has a pulmonary specific role, but it touches and feels all the different tissues, sometimes in an indirect fashion, but all the metabolically active tissues will also affect those types of things.
So, how do you balance this idea? Because I know, right, like I went and did a workout this morning and caused some intentional inflammation in my body I grow from that. And so where's that balance when it comes to like these fine particulates that are in the air we're breathing? And the sense of like, because what I'm getting is like, this is not inflammation that's really benefiting us in any way.
Not the long-term kind. Yeah, that's for sure. Inflammation, we were talking about that for a moment. Inflammation is an interesting thing. It's a topic that's talked about quite a bit. You've got influencers online that are talking about inflammation now, which is, good and bad. In many regards. Inflammation is our internal kind of checks and balances. Inflammation is the process by which we'll respond to things that we don't agree with, respond to things like particulates or anything else. It's kind of our internal alarm system. Inflammation is wonderful. We both are undergoing inflammation right now, thankfully asymptomatic, but those mechanisms are working to combat the things that we should not be grappling with. I like to think of inflammation similar, when you get a cut, for instance, you have redness, you have some swelling. I mean, those are indications that your body is trying to repair itself. Now, on a lower level, you mentioned the particulates you may have breathed when you were huffing and puffing a bit during your workout. Those things also can trigger inflammation. You'll want to eradicate those as best you can. Some of that's done in the lung with macrophages, but those that are so small that get into the circulation can also be targeted through the immune system. So it's the problem with inflammation that occurs when it's chronic. Chronic unmitigated inflammation is where we have problems.
So it's that sense of like, I don't ever get the chance to recover, overcome, eliminate inflammation, right? So like when we're working out, we're stressing ourselves in some way to create this inflammation, but then we rest and recover. And you consider that to like chronic pain. It's like, okay, like my back is just always hurting. I'm never getting a rest to be able to like really take care and fix that. And that's what's happening because we're just constantly surrounded through what we breathe. Like our lungs are never getting a break from.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And that's where inflammation should be acute. Let's respond to the cut. Let's eradicate any pathogen, any infection, those types of things, repair the tissue if they're damaged. But when it's chronic, when that stimulation never goes away, particulates, for example, and that chronic aspect of inflammation runs its course, that's where you're no longer healing and repairing cells and tissues. You can actually cause damage.
So it's a little scary to think about. But so then how does that like directly impact into your metabolism and energy production in the body from this chronic inflammation buildup?
Yeah, good question. So because these particulates are so small, the body has a hard time filtering them out or removing them. I mentioned before, they penetrate so deep in the lung, they bypass all the cilia, the mucus, they get into the bloodstream, and from there they've got carte blanche. They can go wherever they want, wherever the blood takes them. And what happens is they tend to occupy in areas that are biologically active, metabolically active, and those types of things. What happens generally is those particulates, because they cannot be eradicated, they will trigger an inflammatory reaction, but also exacerbate or make worse oxidative stress. And what's interesting is when inflammation runs its course, you set up a situation where cells don't really respond very well to other types of pathways, including those modulated by insulin. So there's an insulin resistance story we talk about later that relates to this inflammatory situation. But at the end of the day, one of the main things to my research is to do something that matters, to help educate everyone about the idea that, yes, what we eat can make us sick. We know about that. And we're uncovering new data all the time. But also what we breathe can make us sick. And the two work together, sometimes overcoming our inherent defense mechanisms. Oftentimes they can be corrected by inherent defense mechanisms. But being aware of those roles, I think, can really shed some light on overall health.
So I'm super eager to get into talking about, like, really understanding, like, how big can this impact be of how we're harming and exacerbating our struggle against insulin resistance because of the air we're breathing and everything's coming in with that. And then talking about what we can do. But before we get into those, right, very interesting topics, I want to make sure we've covered the mechanisms that are going on. And one thing that Dr. Bikman suggests that we get into with this is that topic of glycation.
Yeah.
And how that plays a role in this.
Yeah, you heard me mention oxidative stress and inflammation already, two big buzzwords that are in the discussion today. But what unifies both of those to a large degree is glycation. So let's talk about that. Glycation is an underappreciated aspect of what happens to blood sugar. What I mean by that is, glycation essentially is when excess glucose sticks to important macromolecules like proteins, fats, even nucleic acids like DNA can be what they call glycated. When sugar sticks to those substances, they become what's called an AGE product, AGE. Those are advanced glycation end products. And the problem with the formation of AGEs is that it can accumulate and become active in ways that we don't intend. You mentioned, or rather I mentioned, you may recall me talking about excess glucose. I like to think of glucose as functioning in three main ways. And this is a way that I kind of teach our students in classes that I teach. Glucose we'll use in three ways. The first thing is we're going to burn it, right? This is stuff we learned about in high school, college, where we go through cellular metabolism and oxidative phosphorylation to generate ATP. Right, so this is where we talk about glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. We basically burn it for energy, right? It's a really large, energetically favorable molecule, glucose is, and if we manipulate it in special ways, we can generate ATP, the energy that all of our cells use. So we'll burn it. That's the first thing. The second thing is glucose is also capable of being stored. So if we're getting ready to fast, or we anticipate a period of time with no nourishment, we need glucose all the time, we can store it. Right? So if we have glucose in our system, we'll burn it for energy or we'll store it. And those are the two main kind of concepts that are very well taught in any biology 101 type class. The third thing is the part that is underappreciated, and that's where we'll talk about glycation. If you don't burn glucose, if you don't store it against the rainy day, and anything you don't lose through the urine remains in the body, and that extra will be that sticky glucose that attaches to every molecule in the body. And that's called glycation. It's kind of like when you get syrup on your fingers and it gets sticky. Your fingers still work. You can do things with your fingers. It's just not as well as it could be, and that's annoying, right? So that's what glycation can kind of be. A lot of people have experience with what's considered HbA1c, hemoglobin A1c. And that's a part on a hemoglobin protein that's very sensitive to glycation. And many will just refer to that as A1C.
Yeah, I did always on it a lot.
Yeah. That all of your listeners would have had an A1C level taken in their most recent physical. And I love that measure because what it does is it shows you more than an immediate kind of sensation of what sugar levels are with a CGM that folks would wear. It's more of a long-term, almost a 3-month period of glucose levels. But I hope that in my mission, in my kind of professional life, is to teach everybody that that's a proxy measure of the glycation of just one protein. Hemoglobin is still binding oxygen to a lesser degree CO2. It's doing its work. It's just not doing it as well. So a physician might find, oh, you've got between 4 and 5.5, you're okay. About 5.5 to 6.5, you're pre-diabetic. Over 6.5%, that's where you're truly diagnosed with diabetes. 6.5% of all your hemoglobin has glucose on it. But there are a lot of different reasons why those could be false positives or negatives. Dr. Ben talked about that a few weeks ago. Very sound. But again, it's a proxy measure. I hear people realize that, yes, that's a test that's clinically relevant. There's a CPT code, so physicians get remunerated for doing that test. But every protein in the body is experiencing glycation.
And so what you're saying is that an element of your A1C is reflecting how much glycation is happening in the body.
Exactly.
And so, and that's testing several things. That's one factor of it. But essentially, if you are fairly insulin sensitive, like you've been doing things healthy, but you're super highly glycated, I guess, your score on that is going to be higher.
That's right.
You're going to be trending towards the diabetic or maybe even be diabetic due to its effect.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. It's almost like you've got a buddy that shows up and tells you, hey, my energy bill is massive. I'm paying $700 a month now. Well, that must mean your kitchen light's on, right? And if that's the only thing you look at, you might have to lose sight of the fact that, well, the washing machine's driving nonstop. The lights in the basement are on. I've got kids, so they leave lights on everywhere throughout the house.
Yeah.
So you got all these different things. So yes, your hemoglobin's glycated. You may have diabetes, But let's talk about your collagen or your elastin or albumin that floats around and does important things in the blood. All the proteins that are sniffing and detecting glucose will be glycated. And that's really a harbinger of this rampant inflammation we deal with.
Yeah. And very fascinating. There's a clip I saw probably like 6 months ago. Speaking of influencers, right, talking on the topic, but it was from the came from my ex-gate from the glucose goddess, and she was talking about glycation in the sense of like how this is essentially what is causing your cells to age more quickly as well.
Right.
And so, right, her focus was on, consuming sugar and like things that drive your blood sugar and are going to produce more glycation from, food that you're eating, calories you're intaking.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing that same impact is also coming when we increase our glycation from just the fine particles that we're intaking as well.
That's right. It's interesting. When you talk about glycation, the final product would be ages. Those form in really peculiar ways. I'm not a chemist per se, but I know a lot about the chemistry about how ages form. They don't require an enzyme. So you don't have to wait for certain players to line up to do the work of making an age product or a glycation product. There's no energy that's required. These spontaneously just happen. If sugar and a molecule that has a carbonyl, that's a double bond oxygen, exposed, they will attach, get sticky.
Yeah, almost for lack of energy, might. Yeah, though, because right, if there's energy, then the sugar is hopefully getting used, it's getting burned, right, stored. But when there is,
absolutely. And you mentioned the particulates again. Let's just circle back to that for a moment. There is a receptor for ages, and they call that rage, not the emotion, but the receptor for ages is this protein that's on the membrane of most cell types, and that receptor can bind to ages and then perpetuate a response, and usually that's pro-inflammatory, pro-oxidative stress in nature. And that receptor, interestingly, is a variable domain receptor. What that means is it's not really a lock and key with one ligand and one receptor. Think of like an insulin receptor and insulin. It binds insulin only. That's all it does. But RAGE is variable, so it can bind onto age products, hemoglobin, for instance, albumin, anything else that's glycated, but it also binds these diesel particulates. The variable geometry of the diesel also fits in that pocket. So we might get to, toward the end of our talk today, talk about some of the research that you've done.
Oh, you definitely will.
And it talks about or portrays this idea that it interacts with the same receptors that glycated proteins interact with and do many of the same things.
Yeah, I heard him try. I mean, it's fat talk about that. I recently purchased an older vehicle as diesel. And it's almost like, I just started using super great. There you go. Hello. We'll leave that for the end. And so what I hear is kind of like, it seems like there's these three characters that are getting, right, or that are driving these effects. You have the inflammation, you've got the oxidative stress, you've got the glycation, and my guess is that these are all interfering with each other as well. They are exacerbating it.
Absolutely. So they're all kind of standalone aspects. We talked about inflammation, kind of the guardsman on the tower that watches out for bad guys and responds acutely and then go away. When it's long-term, that's what kind of feeds inflammatory diseases from arthritis to diabetes. So we'll talk about that quite a bit today. Even cancer, right? All of these are pro-inflammatory in nature. The other aspect you mentioned was oxidative stress. That's a buzzword in the world today. A lot of people talk about it, but not a lot of us know enough about it, even the basics. I like to think of oxidative stress as an imbalance between free radicals and our body's normal ability to neutralize those through antioxidants. Free radicals, I like to teach our students this way, and I like to think of them as kind of little troublemakers, little disobedient children that run around, and the reason they're disobedient and unstable is they've lost an electron, and they're running around looking for another electron, and they'll steal it from other molecules, exacerbating this problem as oxidative stress. We have wonderful inherent antioxidant type behavior within the body, so we can overcome that to a large degree. It's where oxidative stress outpaces the antioxidants that causes a problem. And antioxidant issues with regard to perpetuating oxidative stress feeds into inflammation. Both of those cause glycation to be worse. If you have too much sugar in your blood, you'll have more glycation that provides a breeding ground for more oxidative stress. So you're right, they all kind of work together and feed off what happens.
How beneficial is it? So if someone's like, I really want to reduce the oxidative stress in the body, I mean, these high antioxidant, foods mate is packed with antioxidants.
Yeah.
Our Chayoka matcha product is packed with antioxidants. Like how much of an impact can that make in just bringing down that level of oxidative stress in the body and thereby also helping not exacerbate glycation, inflammation, and other.
Right. It is a balance because you'll never completely eradicate, for instance, glycation. You can never turn it off entirely. The liver is so dynamic, and we're so thankful for the liver and everything that it does. One of the things that it does is it will ensure we have adequate amounts of glucose. So we're always going to have a baseline, whatever that is for each of us. No glucose equals death. So please remember, make sure you have plenty.
And that's important for people to understand because, like, people who do keto, for years, or carnivore, or strict carnivore, where it's like, pure beef, bacon, butter,
butter sticks all day long. You're still going to still glucose. Yeah. So when you take products that are antioxidant rich, I'm thinking leafy greens. There's a lot of antioxidant fruits that are available. Those types of things, they will add to the story and they'll improve your redox situation and lessen oxidative stress. But there's no data that says that you'll completely eradicate it altogether.
So then following these three harbingers of bad things.
Yeah.
Our inflammation, glycation, oxidative stress. How do those impact some of these then, like chronic diseases, like you mentioned, diabetes?
Yeah, good question. Excellent question. In fact, if you were to search out and look for data about glycation, almost all of the research has been done in a diabetic world. When it comes to diabetes, obviously, kind of glycation-related complications are going to be way worse in those patients compared to non-diabetic counterparts. And that's sensible, right? Because diabetics have a hard time controlling blood sugar. It's higher. The more sugar you have, again, remember the three-pronged approach. You're not burning or storing, you're going to glycate with it. So the more sugar that's available, the more likely you'll have glycation. That is happening in a diabetic. And so what does glycation do specifically in those folks? Well, I might just foreshadow the next couple of minutes with the idea that there are primary causes in diabetes and maybe other diseases we'll talk about, but something that worsens those primary causes is in fact glycation. There's a very clear connection there. So you know that diabetics have nerve issues, nerve pain, neuron issues. Those are neuropathies. And in fact, when glycation is rampant, they'll damage neurons so that they cannot communicate as well with each other. There may be primary causes for that, but again, that's worsened by glycation. That's why diabetics, more so than, again, the general population, they experience tingling, numbness, even in extremes, loss of sensation in their extremity.
And that's what generally leads to having to have a foot amputated.
Correct. Yeah. So again, the high sugar, the insulin resistance, the metabolically compromised tissues are, I believe, the primary cause of those. But you don't want to pile on when they're feeling that. You don't want to pile on the glycation because those will do their part as well. They're a part of this puzzle and will cause some problems. Another thing that diabetics are known for is to have kidney issues. Those are nephropathies. And when, the kidneys are working really hard all the time, they're filtering blood, they're doing their work. But when glycation is rampant in the glomerulus itself, that's where most of the filtering happens. Those are called glomerulopathies, and that will compromise the kidney's behavior. In fact, they culminate in failure all the time because of these types of things. In the glomerulus, you may have heard of podocytes and the capillaries. They're working together as a sieve to filter blood. But around those cells are special cells called mesangial cells. Those are support cells that are pro-inflammatory. So they're just sitting there. They want to make sure all the capillaries are the right width. They want to make sure all the cells are happy. And when they get perturbed in a glycation sense, they'll release more cytokines, making worse the kidney problem. So again, is salt in glycation going to fix all the kidney problems in the diabetic? Probably not, but it will go a long way to improve those outcomes.
Yeah. And I mean, that's so interesting. I've never really considered this second element, right? Because when I'm diabetic, and I'm insulin resistant, and so my insulin is not getting produced the level it needs to clear out all the blood sugar from the foods I'm eating.
Yeah, this car you trying to make way more.
Hence, people trying to solve it by injecting more insulin to be able to manage that. And kind of what they're doing, it sounds like, is, hey, let's get this insulin in so that we don't create this perfect breeding ground for just glycation and nuts.
Yeah,
which is going to cause all these down the road much more severe, terribles impacts of being diabetic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you add more to the story, you've got retinopathies. They're vision issues, right? Diabetics are known more so than their counterparts to have vision issues, even cataracts in the extremes. And that's because the microvasculature in the retinas are especially prone to glycation. You mentioned the insulin sensitivity idea. I am a full believer in what Ben is telling the world effectively, and that is an insulin sensitivity issue. This drives the progression of diabetes. But there's some brand new data that just came out that talked about how beta cells, yes, they are the ones that are in charge of releasing insulin, but when glycation is rampant, they are also compromised and they don't make as much insulin. So yeah, we got to make sure the tissues are sensitive to the insulin we do make, but we also got to control the cells that actually release the insulin and therefore, contribute to this inability to manage blood glucose.
Yeah. Okay. I'm like kind of hold off going into the next phase of this, but there's still some other, right, diseases and topics. And so to summarize for myself, our lungs through the act of breathing are delivering, right, oxygen to the muscles, the blood, the organs. With that, they're also grabbing different fine particulates that are out in the air, which are not doing this in benefit, right? They're causing chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, right? Additional glycation that's happening. And those three things we've talked about now, how that's exacerbating our insulin resistance and our diabetes, right? These sort of things. What about with some of the other very, right, like symptomatic pieces of insulin resistance? So like I think of things like obesity, even Alzheimer's to an extent. Like, has there been research done on that relationship?
Absolutely. Yes, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned that. Alzheimer's. Should we talk Alzheimer's for a bit?
Yes.
So Alzheimer's is a scary thing.
Very.
Right? Over 100 million people have some form of dementia. About 80% of those are Alzheimer's patients. So, the idea of forgetfulness, memory issues, cognitive decline, very scary topic. And a lot of research has been done over the years, over the decades really, about what causes Alzheimer's and what allows it to perpetuate, to organize. More recently, again, through the efforts of Ben and others, we're starting to identify appropriately Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. You've heard the happy hour. Again, a huge story to be said about insulin sensitivity in the brain and what is an issue as those tissues progress toward this decline. Although glycation is not the primary driver of Alzheimer's disease, it will, in our Western society where sugar levels are too high, it will be a major piece of the puzzle. So what are some issues that Alzheimer's patients experience? Number one, neuron loss. So neurons, when they are glycated, don't communicate well with one another. And what that does is it makes individuals lose their ability to draw connections, draw memories, those types of things. That's one of the steps in this decline. When you think about neurons, there's a checkered history about the role that plaques and tangles play. Although plaque says, again, that checkered past, the tangles are a valid story. Tangles are small accumulations of proteins that interfere with nerves as neurons when they talk to one another. And within these tangles are abundant RAGE molecules and AGEs. So those accumulated proteins, are they there only because of glycation? I don't believe that's the case, but they're made much more worse because of glycation. In fact, 1% of every adult over the age of 60 will experience some form of Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease, one of the main drivers is the loss of dopaminergic neurons. Those are the neurons that talk to each other through dopamine. And RAGE-AGE interactions in those neurons are very well established. Much more research, I think, needs to be done, Heather. When you think about the microvasculature in the brain, nourishing these cells that are very demanding in terms of energy and oxygen, those blood vessels are also compromised. Mostly the endothelial cells, those are the small, thin cells that line the blood vessel. They are sniffing out and detecting the glucose that's high and abnormally. They can also be glycated and cause damage. In the end, this idea of inflammation is reaching its ugly tentacles into the brain as well. Glycation is not a superficial element. It's deep in the tissues as well. In this case, it's called neuroinflammation. And if there's a breeding ground for more inflammation, exacerbated by ages, in addition to the insulin story, those both will combine and cause for unwelcome outcome.
Man, that your explanation of like dipping your hands into a jar of syrup has really helped me see visually how this glycation just starts to damage anywhere it gets out of control. Because like our bodies are such finely tuned machines, and it's been really cool over the last years that people are more trying to look at the bigger picture. Right? We do the specialization, but it's like you can't ever just look at one element of the body because it always interacts with so many more. And it's getting really obvious to me in this conversation how that glycation is going to show up. Probably any time where we've got an issue, chronic disease, anything like that, you're going to see like, oh, this gets worse if you've got different, things glycated in it.
Absolutely. I like that syrup example more and more now. And I also often think about like caramelizing sugar on the stove, right? If you just have a little bit of sugar, it doesn't really work as well. Add more sugar, more heat, more sugar, more heat. The ingredients of glycation, you get the sticky mass, just damaging mass of sugar, right? And these things just don't work well as they should.
Yeah. The Rice Krispie treats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In moderation.
In moderation, yeah. Well, yeah, or not at all, or not at all. Do there. So then, on the glycation, going back to the video, and maybe I should try and find it so we can play it for the audience as well.
Did you know that as a human being, from the moment you're born, you slowly glycate? You slowly cook.
You start to cook.
Yes, like a chicken in the oven. And then when you're fully cooked, you die. I know it sounds crazy, but it is true. And on the inside, you're actually browning. So if you look at the cartilage of a baby, it's white. If you look at the cartilage of somebody who's 100 years old, it's brown. It's been glycated. Glycation is cooking and it's aging. Now, why am I telling you this? Because every time you have a glucose spike, it accelerates glycation. Glucose causes this cooking, causes this glycation, causes this aging. So the more glucose spikes you have, the faster you age. And this shows on your skin as wrinkles, right? I'm actually 85 years old, but you can't tell because I don't have glucose spikes. And it also ages your organs within. And that's just one of the few things that happen when you have too many glucose spikes over time.
Yeah, what is the impact then for glycation on skin health and aging?
Excellent question. Everyone's focused on how well they look, right?
Yeah.
And for good reason. And our overall skin health is something that is increasingly talked about today, and different products are available more so than ever before. And the two main molecules that are involved in making us remain youthful in appearance is collagen and elastin. Those are the two molecules that have the biggest role to play in keeping our skin firm, smooth, elastic, that type of thing. But both of those are very prone to glycation. An extension of the collagen story is arthritis and knee issues, joint pain as we age, made worse by glycation. But when you think about skin, when those molecules are glycated, they lose their resiliency. They make skin feel more tough, rigid, stiff, and in some cases much more wrinkly and saggy. I like to think of it as like a rubber band, right? Who didn't like to play with a rubber band as a kid? Brand new rubber band, fresh from the store. It's very stretchy. It's distensible. You can stretch it out. You let go of it. It recoils. It's just really nice and dynamic. But imagine contrasting that rubber band with one that's sat out for too long. It's an old rubber band, sat in the sun maybe. It gets brittle. It's wrinkly. It's just little cracks on it. Yeah. And that's the same thing that happens when glycation runs rampant. So some of the hallmarks of things that occur when we age, exacerbated by aging or glycation, is the wrinkles and the sagging that happen, the spots that occur, all of those types of things will obviously occur over time because we cannot ever avoid glycation, but mitigation is helpful, right? So if we can avoid foods that are highly conducive to oxidative stress, that helps in the skin as well. That it's the radiance that skin loses over time is by and large due to oxidative stress ramping up as we age. Now keep in mind that we're talking about age formation with regard to sugar that we take into the body, whether it be through processed foods, complex carbohydrates, those types of things. But don't lose sight of the fact that AGEs can also be made available through our diet, right? I mentioned the liver a bit ago. The liver is dynamic. It does a lot of things. One of the things that the liver does for us is it eradicates the dietary AGEs that we ingest. So the glucose goddess, is that who was?
Yeah.
That talked about glycation, may have talked a lot about the dietary AGEs, and those are, let's avoid them as best we can. Processed sugars, complex carbohydrates, grilling, fried foods, those types of things should be avoided. But the data show that maybe about 10% of the AGEs that we ingest are actually remaining in circulation. The liver eradicates a lot of that.
So when talking about skin health and aging, right? Like something that I've been doing recently that I've fallen in love with like my Unicity ritual that I do every morning, waking up, having it, is I'll have my apple spice Unicity hot, but I'll add in a scoop of beef gelatin.
Yeah.
So like 15 grams of pure collagen from grass-fed beef, as you get on Amazon. And I love it. I like the way it, thickens it a slightly bit, makes it a bit of a richer drink and doesn't really impact my flavor at all. And I'm just getting like this 15 grams of collagen, which is like awesome. Yeah. And I've noticed, because I used to do a lot of endurance events in the past, like Ironmans or ultramarathons. I've been mountain climbing. But the big thing that I always run into would be different joint pain after a certain amount of time. I have to take time off and wind down to recover it. And right now in my training, and I haven't been, I'm doing it for long enough, we'll see. But I can already tell you still so much more fluid, elastic kind of resets. It's green, which is something I'm really excited about. And so to me, it seems like, okay, introducing more collagen into the diet is a great way to help with their skin health and elasticity. But if we're not looking at the other side of the equation and looking at how can we reduce the amount of blood sugar spiking that we're getting through our regular consumption of calories and other elements to bring down that glycation happening in our bodies, then we're not going to get as much of the benefit as we're wanting just by beefing up our collagen intake. Is that accurate?
I think that's very sound reasoning. You're right. Some of the things that we do have great benefits. Some, like I do the same. I take a bunch of collagen and small peptides in the morning to start the day before a workout. Many people have enjoyed the lubricative aspects of a beef towel on the skin. Yeah, that type of thing. Does similar things, provides an environment that mitigates to some degree oxidative stress.
I always think about that, but I haven't gotten to the point of started with the beef towel.
Well, maybe in time. Yeah. You know what I like with my Unicity is I'll take it hot as well in the morning often, and put a tablespoon or two of butter into it, and that also has some role to play in mitigating some insulin issues. But yeah, I think there are some sound connections there. The key is this, as you've alluded to, is changing lifestyle with diet, and a regimen that works for you is helpful, because you don't want to unknowingly counteract some of the good things that you're doing by, eating that bag of chips when you get done with your ultra marathon.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's true. I mean, that's why it's so critical to use whatever tools you can to avoid the blood sugar spikes. And just think of it like, hey, the more I'm spiking my blood sugar, the more often I'm doing that, the faster I'm accelerating the aging process in it. And we're creating this breeding grounds for glycation, more ages, to be able to speed these things up. Yeah, generally, most of us don't want to do.
Right. And you know what? Again, the unfortunate news for each of us on this planet is that we will continue to progress in our glycation. Again, the liver glucose story, oxidative stress, inflammation is around us all the time. But there are ways in which we can slow it. And I think that's really helpful. I'm reminded of a funny story. When my brothers and I were really young, we used to go visit grandma, and saintly gal that just loved us. And part of that was she allowed us to do this experiment on her hand. If you do something like this, you just grab skin and pull it up like this and let go of it. It has a tendency to fall right back down really fast. That's in large part due to the elasticity for skin.
Yeah.
But with grandma, she'd let us do the experiment. We can hold it like that, and it would stay up for a while and just slowly make its way down. Again, it's going to happen as we age. We'll lose elastic fibers, but we can speed up that loss by glycating the elastin as well. So there was a role for that as we look at our ketogenic lifestyle origins.
Yeah. Well, before we get into more the side of what can we be doing, No, especially for our diet, it seems to me it's much more encouraging to be like, hey, if you're concerned about insulin resistance, inflammation, glycation, avoid these sorts of things, right? Or add in tools like balance, right? Or other things, of fasting and Umate to reduce that. But when we're talking about the air we breathe, it's like some people want to be listening to this and they live in New York City or LA, right? Places that are hubs, or Salt Lake City in the winters, and version, they're like, what do I do? So before we get to that though, I still want to also touch on the impact of glycation and potentially inflammation or oxidative stress in two other areas, heart health and gut health.
Okay, great. Yeah, great point. There are a lot of data that suggests that glycation has a role to play in cardiovascular health and cardiovascular disease. It's interesting. Glycation has this insidious aspect of where it's happening all the time, kind of sneaks up on you. And, these ages, when they form, they're not just going to hang out and not do anything. They're going to become active. And that activation usually involves interacting with receptors that causes inflammation. So that's very common in cardiovascular health or the loss thereof. Here's a few examples. When you think of blood vessels, they are made up of collagen primarily, a big ingredient. The largest blood vessels also have a lot of elastin. So as those molecules become glycated, meaning they're exposed to higher than normal levels of glucose, they become tough and rigid, and arteries and veins stiffen, blood vessels stiffen. They aren't as resilient. They cannot accommodate big boluses of blood as long as they used to. And that's one of the key initial drivers of higher blood pressure. Yes, there are some primary reasons for high blood pressure, but when these blood vessels are stiffer, the heart has to work harder, and that is directly related to higher than normal levels of blood pressure. So an astute physician or clinician might see that, and I hope would ask lots of questions with regard to not only specific aspects of their cardiovascular health, but their general dietary health as well. That's one thing. The other thing is, on the inside of a blood vessel, those vessels are lined by endothelial cells. I mentioned those before. Those are the thin squamous cells that are intimately interacting with the blood. So as blood is racing by these cells and they see glucose all over the place, they get worried. Those cells can also be glycated. Those cells can be damaged. In fact, sometimes they'll rupture and provide sites where fatty deposits, some types of cholesterols, other things can attach, and that's the start of an atherosclerotic plaque. It's not the only reason for it, and there are dietary issues why those would be rampant. But when glycation is sprinkled in among those primary reasons, you speed up the process of forming those plaques. So in a cardiovascular world, you're well on your way to a heart attack. You have strokes that are rampant when those types of plaques are in the most extreme. Inflammation is always happening. That's a great breeding ground for lots of other problems, including probably wound repair and clot formation. We always are out to get clots formed in areas where there are damaged vessels, but when those are too rampant, those obviously can cause some problems as well. So that's kind of a story about cardiovascular health, and where, again, the main driver is likely not glycation, but it is a major piece in that puzzle of cardiovascular demise. You mentioned gut health.
Yeah.
I love that because, a lot of people are getting more excited all the time about what gut health is. Some people even call the gut our second brain because it impacts our digestive health, our immunity, even our mood in some regard. So when you think about gut health, lo and behold, there are lots of data that show that glycation does have a role to play, but not a good one, unfortunately.
It doesn't seem like it never does.
Yeah, we're going to get this. So here are some examples of what I mean by that. On the inside of the gut is a group of cells. They're called enterocytes. They're epithelial cells, and they're tightly linked together. In fact, the proteins that zipper these cells together do so tightly that we just cheap and call them tight junctions. Those are the junctions that hold those cells. And that's why the stuff in the lumen, the empty space of the gut, stays there. Undigested material that hasn't yet been digested or indigestible material should stay there. But when there's a lot of glucose floating through and glucose in the vasculature is available, those tight junctions can be glycated as well. They become misregulated. They loosen up a bit. And that is not the only cause, but it is a cause of what we now call leaky gut. Things falling out of the gut into the vasculature that shouldn't go there. That's a problem. The other The other one is the microbiome. You know, a lot of people talk about that, thankfully, more so now than ever before. Let's just set the stage by saying that the microbiome is something that keeps our gut healthy, keeps our overall biology healthy. A healthy gut has a nice balance between the good, beneficial bacteria at the expense of the not beneficial bacteria or problematic bacteria. But when glycation is rampant, there is a tendency to foster the bad bacteria at the expense of the good bacteria, causing some imbalances. Now that might be immediately manifest in the form of bloating and some gas. Maybe the slight extreme of that might be irritable bowel syndrome. Again, there are primary causes for that, but they're worsened by glycation and exorbitant amounts of sugar. Yeah. You know, but beyond that, when they're so rampant that inflammation spikes, that's where you kind of bridge the gap from, irritable bowel, for example, toward a more inflammatory outcome. Ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, again, they're primary causes, but they're so much worse in patients that have an inability to control their blood sugar and therefore rampant glycation.
Wow. So glycation is a bad guy. Essentially, by exacerbating my glycation aspects, right? So the various mechanisms that do that, right? And we're pretty familiar with the impact of our diets and glycation. We're learning about the impacts on the air we breathe and what comes with it in glycation. But both of those are can accelerate the issues in our gut from, unhealthy gut to leaky gut, from IBS or bowel syndrome all the way to Crohn's disease. And even if someone has, this from other conditions in their life, essentially their condition will be worsened because the glycation is worse, right? They're feeding that part of the...
And the opposite side of the coin is also true. It can be mitigated or improved somewhat.
Yeah, not only my Crohn's disease can be less intense, less severe, while looking at, okay, what am I doing to monitor my glycation?
Right. Yeah. How can I better control blood sugar? Yeah. How can I have more a ketogenic state more often than not? Doesn't have to be exclusively ketogenic, but how is it that we can offset the glucose excursions that too many of us are dissipated?
Yeah. So, is there any good things about glycation?
I hear that question all the time because my background and training is mostly in developmental biology back in the day. And so a lot of the developmental biologists over the years come up to me and said, hey, if glycation is so bad, this RAGE receptor that binds glycation products is so bad, why didn't we evolutionarily select against it or somehow develop some redundancies to bypass the problems? And I think that's a good point initially, but maybe a bit too superficial, if you would allow that.
I mean, I almost think evolutionarily, maybe we kind of did. Right? And it's we just re-engineered our environment and what's going in to all of a sudden, our evolutionary biology, we weren't built for this.
Right. And we are exposed to so many more things that we ever have, never had been in the past. But I think where I kind of hang my hat is on the immunologic aspects of living here. This is a dirty world, right? There are lots of things that we grapple with. And if we didn't have a mechanism to sense, oh, wow, that's a bad thing, let's perpetuate a response, then those things would accumulate to, I think, our sooner demise rather than later, if that makes sense. So we have the ability to respond to glycation mostly so we can try to make correction, I believe. We can detect glycation. We can induce inflammation. Oh, that's a bad thing. Let's correct it and move on. Please remember to turn off inflammation when you're done. It's kind of the goal.
So you're saying it's kind of like a practice grounds for our body in terms of responding to all sorts of bad things that are coming in.
Correct. Yeah, when you look at our diet a couple of centuries ago, we'd never had all this processed stuff. We never had foods that came in boxes with barcodes, right? Yeah. So we're exposed to things we've never been exposed to before, but the inherent mechanisms by which those cause problems are still there, thankfully. And I think despite all the scary part of the story that I shared with you today, there are some silver linings to this, right? If we can correct that, remove some of those excursions as best as possible, then we'll make some good improvement.
Yeah. All of this is really helping cement even more in my mind the idea that, there is no magic pill, right, for resolving these problems. It's nature is out to get you in so many ways, and there's so many different elements that if you think it's like, okay, this prescription, this injection, this thing is going to solve everything, well, you're wrong, because there's just too many other elements.
Right.
And so now that we've really covered, I think, pretty thoroughly the problem side of the equation with glycation, oxidative stress, inflammation, and we've touched on the idea of, hey, diet and lifestyle can really reduce this. I want to spend a little bit more time on the lifestyle aspect, because where diet, I think, like from our conversations with Ben and just in general, we really understand, at least in the Unicity audience, that like, yeah, you want to reduce the amount of blood sugar spikes. Right? By lifestyle changes, by implementing tools like adding the right balance to your meals to just bring that down. It's just giving your body like this much needed escape from it. But what are the different lifestyle things, whether that's exercise or other things, that can also help us to reduce the glycation or these other elements?
Yeah, a good question. There are a few things that we can do that come to mind that would be quite helpful. Some of these are easier said than done, but they are things that when we address them over time can lead to some improvement. Number one is this idea of stress, right? Who doesn't deal with stress? We live in a stressful environment. A lot of us work at cubicles, we work long days, we're dealing with financial issues, lots of stresses all around. So a way to mitigate that stress, any way that you can go about mitigating that would be quite helpful. The stress hormones are cortisol and your fight or flight hormone, epinephrine. And when those two run rampant, then you have some issues. You can't survive without them. That's a fatal enterprise. But mitigating the spikes that occur in that area would be helpful. Part of the story that overlaps with the stress mitigation is good sleep. So, I had periods in my life where I slept better than others. I sleep quite well now. I think mostly because I might do a bit more nasal breathing than I have in the past. But good sleep is something that will slow down or mitigate the inflammation that many of us deal with. But as I think what comes to the top of this list is, as is the case with most things in health, diet is the key. We've mentioned several times, focus on, the leafy greens, for example. Those things that are antioxidant rich are very helpful. You mentioned fiber. We've done some research in our lab that focuses on good and natural fiber, the type of fiber that's in balance. And fiber is great because, as you mentioned, it reduces the postprandial glucose load. You get a big spike when you eat, and that persists for a period of time, usually up to 3 hours. And so if you can reduce the area under the curve with good fiber, that's quite helpful. Directly, what that'll do is help you with your insulin resistance. A wonderful story that Unicity is doing an excellent job getting out into the world. Let's make our tissues more insulin sensitive so that we can be more healthy. But this indirect addition, that what's happening is if glucose is lower, insulin is more sensitive, so you can store glucose better. You're nailing at the crux this issue of glycation, right? There's not as much glycation or glucose of the third variety, burning, storing glycation. And if you don't have as much glucose, you will mitigate the amount of glycation. And that's probably where most of the story is. But same is true for, the microbiome. I mentioned that a bit ago.
Yeah.
If you can control sugar better, there are ingredients within fiber that help to foster a more effective flora, enhancement of the beneficial microbiome as opposed to the harmful one, makes us more insulin sensitive as well. And again, the more insulin sensitive we are, the more we'll take that glucose, even though there may have been a Rice Krispie treat on the beginning of that story, take that glucose and store it better in cells that are willing to receive it if they're sensitive enough. And thus cut back on the glycation as well.
Yeah. And so by investing in improving my insulin sensitivity, my metabolic flexibility, I'm creating a situation where, I can live my life and, have that treat because my body can handle it and store it or use it or burn it. Which probably goes into a lot of why people are seeing so much benefit from, they have a big meal, they eat some things that were indulgent, and then going on that walk. We're like, either going up and doing some body weight squats, somewhere to try and, help my body to use this energy.
Exactly. Take the stairs when you can, get off the couch, just move it. Any exercise that you'll do is the best thing. Just keep moving.
Yeah. So then how about now with your specialty on the other side of this. I want to I think for the most part in the wider world of people who even listen to Dr. Bikman, they never consider the fine particulates and what they're having, what the impact that those are having in these mechanisms of exacerbating glycation, inflammation, oxidative stress. So what do we do? Like
about the particulates? Yeah. So a lot of us do live in environments that we can't do much about, that we have a lot of pollution that we're dealing with. And we've made a name for ourselves in the area of studying diesel particulate matter. I'll call that DPM. Diesel particulate matter, or DPM, are small combusted pieces of diesel fuel that, again, abundantly available in the atmosphere. They're so small, many will call them PM 2.5. That means particulate matter that's less than 2.5 microns across. Really small. A micron is a millionth of a meter, itty bitty. So these are so small, they bypass all of the defensive mechanisms in the lung and get into the bloodstream.
Yeah, it's like you're not putting on a mask and preventing these from getting.
Yeah, no, they're in this room. They're everywhere, and it's just what we deal with. Now, thankfully, we have some great protective mechanisms. You should not get rid of your diesel truck just yet.
No, don't do that.
There are some great mechanisms, and healthier folks will enjoy those, I think, to a greater degree than those that aren't. But we studied, like I say, for a decade and a half or so, the consequences of diesel particulate matter. We have found, as well as others have found, that yes, the first point of contact based on our anatomic interposition with the environment, the lung is going to be compromised. The lung will have some inflammation that is activated by excessive diesel. But more than that, we and others have found that those particulates are everywhere. They're in the brain. They're in fat tissue. And that's kind of where Ben and I focused our research in the most recent past, is the consequences of what happens with diesel breathing, fine particulate breathing, on fat cell biology.
And this is a really interesting story for you, because from what I understand, there's two kind of stories to this study. And so there was the initial study that was done with the diesel fumes and showing what our product Super Green can do for it. And then there was this later discovery when you're like, well, let's look closer at the fat molecules in these.
Yes.
And so I'd love for you to just walk through, what was the initial purpose of the study? What did we learn? Or the findings? And then when you revisited that, now what are you learning?
Right. No, that's a great segue, and thank you for doing that. We've been interested, like I say, in diesel for a long time. One of the hats that I wear in the lab is one that causes me to ask questions about macrophages. Those are the small leukocytes that float around, and they're in the lung. They're everywhere in the body. They're very loyal to the tissue they're in, so they don't move from one organ to the other. But they're in charge of just like being a street sweeper. They'll walk around and look for bad things and eat them. So how much can they handle? How much of this diesel can they eat is one of the things that I have questions about. But in taking the blinders off and jumping out of my pulmonary silo into this world of metabolic health is really an eye-opening, because we find that these diesel particulate matters are in fat cells. So what we did was we did a study where we took a mouse model, and mice have fat biology that mimics ours. So they're a great model, and they also are obligate nasal respirators, so they have to breathe through their nose. Thus, there's a great way in which we can get those fine particulates into the respiratory system, not onto their coats, for example, where they'll groom and eat, ingest, and that kind of thing. So these animals that were exposed to diesel particulate matter had some pretty novel outcomes. Number one, they had metabolic issues of a mitochondrial sense. So the mitochondria were not doing very well. It did not make as much ATP. They weren't as efficient in utilizing oxygen compared to the mice that were exposed to just normal, clean, cooling air. So that was very intriguing. We thought that if that was the case in the lung, could it be also apparent in other tissues? And in fact, it was. We looked at muscle and fat, primarily. We also found that systemic inflammation was rampant. So again, inhaling particulates in the lung a generation ago would have caused scientists to think of lung disease only, but it's so much more than that. So when we looked at blood that was throughout the whole body, we found there was an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines. Those are small molecules that recruit white blood cells to do inflammation, cause migration of other cells, breaks down natures, all those types of inflammatory problems. So those were increased with diesel, which we anticipated, and lessened, of course, in comparison to the controls. But then, as you mentioned, after the fact, we wanted to look more specifically at the morphology or the shape of the muscle cells. Muscle is so cool. Fat cells. I'm thinking fat cells are so cool because the way we store fat is directly related to our overall health status. And what I mean by that is fat is an energy reserve, for sure. It's an endocrine gland. It secretes hormones, and it's also a modulator of inflammation. So when we have fat cells that are really large, and over time they get larger, that's called hypertrophy. That's the unhealthy type of fat. And that the way we store fat like that is directly related to the obesity epidemic that we experience today. As opposed to that, if you proliferate the fat and make more fat cells that are smaller in nature, that's a more healthy way to store our fat. So we looked at fat cells in animals that were exposed to diesel and found that they were in fact larger than the fat cells that you found in the controls. So really mind-blowing in terms of, let's talk about a pulmonary assault, particles that all of us are breathing all the time, and look at some of the biology. We started to see some pretty intriguing outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's saying, okay, by breathing in this pollution, which is inevitable. I mean, there's places that are cleaner. I know, like, Puerto Rico is some of the cleanest air on the planet. At times, the cleanest air on the planet. But in Las Vegas, it goes up and down. It's a city of 2 million plus people. And you have places really inversion, right? You have places, India, right? Delhi, where it's like a day outside is extravagant for a bag of cigarettes.
Yeah.
And so all of that, though, is just feeding. It's making our metabolism struggle, right? It's no longer firing all cylinders. We're not being as efficient.
Yeah, you got the brain fog, you got memory things, you got all these things.
Yeah, working through your advantage. Your fat cells are becoming more insulin resistant, which means that they're getting larger, more hypertrophic, and more prone to that. So, what do people do, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I mentioned all of those bad outcomes, not to scare people, because you're right. In various areas throughout the world, there's a dynamic change from one place to the other in terms of pollution. And note that even though you might live in areas that are highly polluted, you do have an accentuated immune system in some regard, where those macrophages are going to eat as much as they can, burst, and then eradicate the bacteria. So you're still working really hard to do that, but why not make the system a bit easier to do that, right? Why not help in ways that we can? So what we did was we looked at chlorophyll as one of the potential sinks that we can throw all these glycation products at ages into. So specifically what we looked at was chlorophyllin. Chlorophyllin is a water-soluble derivative of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the green pigment in plants. And it's well known even before we talked together with Unicity about these products. The literature is very supportive of the idea that it's antioxidant in nature, can bind toxins even quite well. And these, small metabolites and small particulates are toxic in nature in abundance. So we already had kind of a feel that may be quite beneficial. And so we expanded the study where, again, we have room air controlled animals, and then those that are exposed to diesel particulates through their nose. And then a third group are those that had the same diesel particulate exposure, but also had free access to chlorophyllin, the main ingredients in super green and other chlorophyll-based products. And wow, we started to see some really nice correction in that regard. It's not going to be the whole story. We do need to learn a bit more maybe about why it's doing it. But what chlorophyll is probably doing in this article is it mitigates the inflammation. So we saw that animals that were exposed to both diesel and chlorophyll had lower levels of two important cytokines in the body, TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 or IL-6. Those are two of the first responders to exposure-based assault. So that was very nice to see that had a nice role to play there. We also saw that the mitochondria were more healthy, so they were able to utilize oxygen more efficiently, and ATP levels were restored to control levels. So the energetics involved were quite nice. But I was most intrigued about, again, fat cell issue. Yeah, right. Again, it's a qualitative measure. We didn't look at every fat cell in a mouse, but hundreds of them showed us that fat cells are getting larger with diesel exposure, and the degree to which they grow is lessened. It was rescued, not entirely, but almost entirely, by this chlorophyll exposure. So,
yeah, very, very exciting information. It's so good. I mean, it's so exciting. You have like these mice that are just breathing clean air, and it's like, okay, we're not seeing these effects. You have mice that are having the diesel fumes, and it's like, oh my gosh, look at all this hypertrophy in their fat cells. And then you have the ones that get the chlorophyll, right? They're also consuming this when we get in super grain, and it's like, oh, most of that hypertrophic effect on the fat cells is gone.
yeah.
You know, it's still, it's better to not be sucking down diesel fumes at all. But if you can't avoid it, then this is like one of the best measures that you can put up.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, hey, I'm going to my family's, party for Dad's 70th birthday. There's going to be some food, right? And it's going to be awkward if I don't eat any of the treats or something.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to have balance support. Because like, okay, this protects me from it. And it's the same thing. It's like, hey, I live in Mexico City. There's nothing I can do to avoid being assaulted by fine particulates everywhere I go.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to make sure that I'm like consistently consuming this chlorophyll, have a really quality source for it to give myself like, this aid. And hey, let me just reduce these effects. Let me get rid of them.
Yeah, exactly. And I love the way you put that, is the natural aspects of chlorophyll or chlorophyllin, much more than too many other products out there that are highly processed, and you're not getting what you're paying for.
Yeah.
So there's a great story there. Now, I believe everything in my mind is screaming out glycation role in all of this. So I think there's a place for both, right? You want to take some balance beforehand. The fiber aspect, alleviates the postprandial sugar spike, indirectly hurting your glycation potential, which is helpful. But also the chlorophyllin is interesting because keep in mind, these age products are very similar. They're indistinguishable from the diesel. So the RAGE, that's the receptor, the cell, they're looking around for anything that'll fit in the pocket. And whether it's a glycated protein that your body made or a piece of diesel that your engine made, it doesn't care. It's going to do the same outcome. So there's definitely a role for glycation we've not yet teased out yet.
That's how research thing.
But there's going to be a lot of overlap there and a lot of rescue possibility.
Yeah, and I think for me the most exciting thing on this is like, let's say we've got someone, I think there's like two cases that are really clear in my mind with this. There's the person who they get introduced to this whole world. I'm taking care of their health, right? And they're like, okay, I'm diabetic. My A1C is at 9.3. I'm overweight, and I'm like, I want to take control of my health and do some things. And so they get introduced to Feel Great, and they're like, okay, I'm going to start doing some intermittent fasting. I'm going to be using Unicity to assist with that. I'm going to be having balance before my heavy meals. But what else can I do? Like, I want to speed up the recovery of my body and reducing the glycation. And essentially it's like, okay, if I want to add in the Super Green Plus product, you bring in this, right, this chlorophyll into my diet consistently, that's just going to aid my body in getting it to what I want to do.
Right. It's just going to, again, be adding more tools to your tool belt. Is there going to be just one wrench that'll fix every problem? No, that's not going to get you very far. But addressing the oxidative stress and the inflammation that chlorophyll does, the antioxidant aspects in particular, the balance that helps mitigate blood glucose, so all of these different players are not feeding toward glycation. There are other things that you could do, avoiding pollution as best you can. People like whole home filtering, there are lots of things. But again, none of those are going to be the end all for the process.
Yeah, there's no way to eliminate oxidative stress in the body. There's no way to eliminate glycation hype, entirely. But yeah, I mean, on the other side of the equation, like there's someone like me who, I don't know, I've been around for a long time. I really understand this. Right now I'm eating like a carnivore diet because I feel great on that. I love it. But I'm like never really satisfied. I'm always like, oh, what other advantages can I give myself? And this is like, oh, Sam, like, how consistent are you being in consuming some chlorophyll in your diet? Well, obviously I'm not getting any of it from my diet in a sense, because it's like I'm not eating any greens. Yeah, no greens. But I can have the supplement that is giving me this added edge.
Yeah.
Like I've always just been enamored with the idea in my body of like anything I'm taking that's giving my body like this added advance. Perhaps like this reinforcements or like, hey, let's get the job done.
No, that's great. All the tools you can give yourself, the better, right? We're going to address our insulin sensitivity. We're going to get this ketogenic lifestyle going, but at the same time, mitigating some of the bad guys in the background. That's going to help.
Yeah. Anything else on this topic? Because now I've covered the main things I wanted to, strictly for like the Unicity, our listeners, to get like kind of what they're most interested in.
Yeah, I think the best summary of that is just, again, fine particulates or breathing in general is not just a long story. It's going to reach into all aspects of health. The more we appreciate that, the more we'll move our own needle.
So now I have some other questions that was interesting for me. So hopefully other people find them interesting as well. And so there's been a lot of emphasis in recent times and some emergence of really now famous people with like various breathing techniques and how this can be hugely impactful. I think Wim Hof is a very intriguing figure in terms of like how through the specific breathing techniques that he applies, it impacts his bodily performance in all these other areas, like controlling his body temperature when it's exposed to just frigid environments, ice baths, running a marathon in the Antarctica in your shorts, right? Like all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And that's just something as talking to a lung expert, I'm just really curious on your take as to like, okay, when it comes to breathing, is there like a good, better, best? And are there specific types of like breathing workouts that can be super beneficial for us to be doing in certain times?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this. This has admittedly taken a bit of a backseat in our research lab in terms of the more metabolically relevant things we've been looking at, but it is dear to my heart, this idea of breathing and breathing well. You mentioned a few folks that have become famous of late. One I'm reminded of is Patrick McKeown. He wrote the book called Oxygen Advantage. I fully agree with what he's postulated in that. He comes from a background where personal experience has led him to make changes in his life, and basically his story is quite compelling. But from a respiratory sense, a pulmonary guy, there are clear advantages that our species have participated in based on nasal breathing. So let's talk about that for just a moment. Although not related directly to the question you had as far as athletic performance or other things, but from a craniofacial standpoint, we as a species, and if you look at anthropological evidence over the eons, you would expect to see that there's a really nice dental arch in the skeletal record of our species. And that's by and large due to the fact that folks have breathed through their nose for long periods of time. It's just more of a recent phenomenon where we shifted from that. If you try it right now, breathing through your nose, place your tongue with force on the palate, and that is what happens when you nasally breathe. It's really hard to breathe through your nose with your tongue depressed. It's possible, but you're trying it out, right? I always like to see people's facial expressions when I ask them that. It's challenging, but that's not optimal, right? So what are the effects of that? Well, again, through a developmental context or long periods of time, we have really nice arched palates, really nice dentition. Look at the skeletal record to our species. 200 years ago, there were no orthodontists working. They would be out of work. All the teeth were perfectly straight. We had really nice craniofacial aspect, and that comes from nasal breathing. But in an era where, again, we're exposed to so many stresses, we're eating things that are processed. About the time of the Norman Conquest is when sugar was made available on the continent, and from there, processed foods started to ramp up. Usually, it spikes. Many say around the 1600s or so. Major changes in skeletal arrangement at that point. But when you think about nasal breathing, there are some biologically beneficial aspects that come from breathing through your nose. The first thing is that nasal cavity is the best source, other than your heart, for the generation and release of nitric oxide, NO. Nitric oxide is historically considered to be a bad molecule before the 1980s. It was a main component of smog. It was used in chemical weapons. So essentially, nitric oxide outside of the body, bad, and don't want it. But the nitric oxide that we make in the body is very beneficial, and it reaches into lots of different processes. In fact, if I remember, I think it was 1993 or 95, nitric oxide was considered the molecule of the year. Yeah. A couple of Nobel Prizes came from work focused on nitric oxide. And your nose makes it all the time. But when you're breathing through your mouth, which is more of a sympathetic aspect of breathing, you're stressed, you're looking around, you don't capture that nitric oxide. It just falls out through the nose. The nose is really cool. It's built in a way that there are two pursed openings, the nostrils, and then right after that, there's a huge vacuous spot. In fact, 2/3 of the nasal cavity is in your head. You don't even see it. It's not the protuberance only. Yeah, way back there, right? So it's built beautifully because air can rush in through the pursing of the nostrils, rushes in fast, and then it immediately slows down. But what it does when it slows down is it can be humidified. It can be cleansed as best as possible. And importantly, it grabs all this nitric oxide and then makes its way down into the lung. What does nitric oxide do? Well, it dilates or opens up airways. And it also dilates and opens up the vasculature, blood vessels. So when you're breathing through the nose, you carry all that in there, your airways open larger, you have much more oxygenation capacity. So nasal breathers do well, athletically speaking. For sure, I remember one time when I exercised and I breathed through my mouth. That's possible for the record. Maybe more than one time, but when you get really windy, you could do that, right?
Yeah.
And the anthropological evidence is replete with that. We were built in that way where, wow, I'm going to die or I'm going to run really fast. You run really fast, you might have to breathe like that. Well, immediately you should return back to this nasal breathing, right? Any veterinarian would look at an animal that's breathing through their mouth and make what conclusion? That animal's sick, right? It's not normal. They all breathe through their nose. Dogs are a bit different with regard to their panting. But where you go with that is this idea of oxygenation and your ability to reach VO2 max faster and more efficiently. So that's kind of the story.
Yeah.
And I think we've known about that stuff for a long time. We're just remembering it.
Yeah.
Species.
It's so fascinating because there's two huge benefits of like breathing through your nose. You have the aesthetic aspect of helping better your whole facial structure. And then you have this massive biological benefit in terms of the nitric oxide and like just getting more oxygen into your body.
Yeah.
Which is so big. I mean, I'd be interested someday, maybe it's something you'll look into, but something that we've been discovering recently is how something Unicity increases the amount of oxygen that you're able to bring in. And we're like seeing how it's beneficial for people on asthma or just like low, and I don't think it's something we totally understand yet. There's been lots of things that we discovered this Unicity thing, we started using it, and we go on learning more and more and more benefits it's providing. But
that's great. That'd be definitely exciting.
Yeah. I'll give Dan, send you some of the stuff that we've come up with on it, and just like some of these active compounds where like, you would pay attention to that, but it's really generating a lot of this benefit.
That'd be great because you're looking at the compounds and what they might be doing. But again, we'll take the blinders off. There's a whole huge story here to focus on. When I talk about nitric oxide, for example, if you're breathing through your mouth, you're more of the upper chest breathing. You've seen that quite a bit. Stress breathing, sympathetic branch of the nervous system was active in that case. Nasal breathing is more diaphragmatic breathing. So there's a really interesting rearrangement of what nitric oxide does. It brings air down to the lower part of the lung because the airway is annihilated. But nitric oxide also manages vasculature. So it brings blood, which is mostly in the bottom of the lung, more toward the apex top. So it's a really nice distribution of oxygen and blood. We always want that. We want 100% in a fusion rate. Air and blood should match perfectly. But we have too much air up here, too much blood down there. We're just breathing too much, and it's not helpful.
Yeah. And I selfishly, as someone who spends too much time on planes crying with other people, they want to get this information out there. Maybe some more people are breathing through their nose quietly. It's very right.
Yeah.
And my wife she'll often get mad at me when we have a newborn. She'll often find me like closing their mouth because it just drops out in. And it's like, sure, that story. That's
George, what's his name, that Patrick McEwen talked about in his book. Native Americans would do that. Shut that mouth.
Yeah. Shut mouth and live. I'll just be sleeping and just push that chin up, hold it a little bit, and the next thing you know, the breathing's there and out.
Here's some more ammo for you and your wife.
Yeah.
There are some really cool data that show that the reverberation or the vibration that happens in the nose increases about 10% the amount of nitric oxide you make. So here's something that'll blow your mind. Yogists back in the day, hundreds of years ago, they're humming, stuff like that. I don't think they knew the science behind it, but humming while breathing through your nose, 15% more nitric oxide. So unlike me, when I was a kid, humming at the table, getting in trouble, you should leverage this with your wife. You can hum at the table. You can hum on the plane, and breathe through your nose.
I don't know how I want to start humming on the phone yet. With the but that's so fascinating. So then, and yeah, I'm feeling like this is a little subject, but I know there'll be at least some people interested in this. So let's say you're doing one of these breathing exercises, right? And so the classic Wim Hof one is where you take these, 30 big breaths in and out, and ideally through your nose because you're driving a lot of that nitric oxide into it. So you're going, like letting it out, all the way in, all the way out. You do that 30 times, and on the 30th, you let it all out, and you're holding your breath as long as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And you go until you just really can't anymore. Take a big breath in, hold that for 15 seconds, and then go back to breathing normally. And you can do multiple rounds of that.
Yeah.
Like, why is that? I know because I've done that so many times. Like, I know it feels great.
Yeah.
And it's like good. But I couldn't really tell you exactly why.
Yeah. I think there are a few different variables working for you in that case. The first one, again, is always going to come down to the nitric oxide distribution.
Yeah.
So you're going to get more oxygenation. And importantly, what you'll get is a greater sensitivity to CO2. CO2, when you're a kid growing up, going to school, you learn about CO2. Oh, that's just a waste gas. We don't need that. That's terrible. No, that makes CO2 feel bad when you talk to me about it. Don't do that. CO2 is very helpful. In fact, CO2 is the molecule that is at the gate of cells that allow, in an analogy type of a way, for oxygenation to run its course. It's CO2 abundance that tells, by way of partial pressure, when oxygen should leave the blood and go nourish the tissue. It's not really the other way around. That made me think. In fact, that was made famous by Bohr. Christian Bohr was the dad of Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr got the family's Nobel Prize for his work in physics. But Christian Bohr was the one that talked about the Bohr effect and the intimate relationship between CO2 and oxygen. So when you do exercises like that, number one, it's going to be sensitivity to and an appreciation of carbon dioxide, number one. Number two, elaboration and the benefits of nitric oxide. But what I also like to think about is, again, the side effects, not just of the respiratory or gas exchange type story, but the side effects of mood and your nervous system. When you shift, we're both undergoing a sympathetic and parasympathetic response right now. I'm detecting from everybody in the room here that we're more parasympathetic than we're getting ready to fight or flee. It's the ratios, right? That never one is off compared to the other. So this nasal breathing, it has a tendency in a diaphragmatic fashion to instill via the vagus nerve this relaxation effect. So when you feel like, wow, that's great, part of that is, again, the nervous system telling you, hey, things are okay. So there's that story as well.
Is that why people who are ventilating, though, put them in, I'm breathing into a bag? Is that a similar?
Yeah. So when you do that, breathing through the bag, through your mouth, that's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. You're telling your primal self that, wow, I'm a gazelle, I look tasty, there's a cheetah over there, I'm going to hyperventilate, get some juices flowing, and hopefully snap out of whatever the condition you were experiencing.
And so tying this back into our larger conversation, are there potentially long-term benefits in terms of my body's ability to, just with my inflammation, oxidative stress, glycation, through kind of exercising and focusing on my nitric oxide, nasal breathing, carbon dioxide management, and the signaling to that and how I can handle that? Is that going to provide me any benefit in these other areas we discussed? Or are they kind of benefiting from different areas of my mind, the body? And
yeah, I think they're all going to add together to your overall well-being. And here's what I mean by that. I don't think any one of those things you've mentioned by themselves will move the needle so much that you'll appreciate, wow, that's the one thing I need to do. I'll still eat the Twinkies, but I'm going to definitely focus on my breathing. Don't do that, right? So all of these are going to help as a piece of the big puzzle. When you mingle in good nasal breathing that has nitric oxide with a ketogenic lifestyle, and that's where the respiration stuff that I bring to the table works with what Ven has studied for years. This ketogenic lifestyle is buttressed by nasal breathing and vice versa. Nasal breathing that generates nitric oxide has a tendency to make more common the effects of ketones. They kind of work off one another. And in fact, both of them can also be anti-glycative in nature. So Do we know the whole story there? I don't think so yet. But the fact that they're all kind of giving each other high fives and working together, I think that's a story that we'll uncover very soon.
Yeah, exciting.
You'll be the guinea pig. Should we do that?
I'm the guinea pig. I really am. I've been doing it for my whole life with Unicity products. So
I'm looking forward to that story about the breathing and the Unimate in particular.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'll look it up right after this. And so, well, before we wrap up, Paul, is there for people in the Unicity audience that want to learn more about the work you're doing, or anyone else who's listening to this, is there anywhere where you recommend them taking a look or finding more info?
Yeah, so I'm just kind of beginning to establish kind of a social media presence, doing my one little part in the whole world of social media. So they can find me there on any of the platforms. I usually post small little snippets of our research or ways in which these products can help with your overall health, aspects about glycation and how it impacts, different disease states. All those types of stories are common out there. So they can look me up that way.
Okay. Or what should they look up? Dr. Paul Reynolds?
Yeah, Paul Reynolds, PhD.
Paul Reynolds, PhD.
At Paul Reynolds, PhD. X, Instagram, Facebook.
Got it. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming into Las Vegas. It was a pleasure. That was a lot of fun. Yeah. Well, at least you are fun. Super interesting for us. And we'll look forward to having you back and having you. I think people will start seeing you at different, events or pull you out to speak to us in person, that people ask some questions. And that'd be wonderful.
Very, very fun times.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. Thanks again.
My pleasure.